Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, all three stories are about the economy. One is about what the latest government data reveals about how the Indian economy has been transforming, and another is about the push to increase medical tourism in the country and how that can be made possible. But we begin today by talking about the Hindu rate of growth. Last Sunday, the former Reserve Bank of India Governor Raghuram Rajan was quoted saying that India is dangerously close to the Hindu rate of growth, and that this was a worrying sign. In this segment, we speak to Indian Express's Udit Misra, who writes on the economy for the paper, about this comment and what it really means. So, Udit, what does the Hindu rate of growth really mean? Where does this phrasing come from?
Right. So, the Hindu rate of growth is a term in economic literature now because it was first used by an Indian economist, Raj Krishna, and he used it, I think, in 1982. And he had been sort of following the Indian economy, working in different capacities. And he was actually considered to be a right-winger in that time. He was quite against the Congress government in terms of policy recommendations and stuff. And he had used this phrase, Hindu rate of growth, in a polemical manner. It was to attract attention to the fact that India had not grown fast enough over the first 3-4 decades. So that's where it came from. And I was reading the new Oxford Companion to Indian Economy, which talks about origins or the reasons why this phrase was used. And let me just quote something from that. The Hindu rate of growth was a polemical device used by Raj Krishna, intended to draw attention to the meager 3.5% growth rate experienced by India over the long run. What we're talking about, the long run, is roughly, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the fact that this growth rate sort of remained steady right through that period, despite the change in governments, wars, famines, and many other crises, that made him feel that this was an inherently cultural phenomenon. And he was a right-winger and he thought like that, and he designated it as a Hindu rate of growth. And this has to be understood. It was not meant to denigrate the Hindu community. It was just to attract attention to the fact that India was growing just about 3.5%, regardless of what happened on an average level. So that was the idea behind it.
And what is the reason that Raghuram Rajan is saying that we are dangerously close to this Hindu rate of growth? Because at the time this phrasing was coined, we were talking about a growth rate which was about 3.5%.
Yeah. So, you have to see it in the context of what India's economy has done over the last few years. And the argument that Dr. Raghuram Rajan gave, he said that, he is worried that he's seeing a sequential slowdown in the quarterly growth rates. And he's bothered about the fact that globally, the environment is turning negative in the sense that interest rates are rising and it's not the most conducive environment for high growth. Now, there are two parts to it. One is to look back at India's growth trajectory. And listeners will realize that, if you look at the data, then from 2017 onwards, we've found that we are sort of slowing down. Every quarter has lower growth. I was calculating the, quarterly GDP growth rates, and I found that in 9 of the 14 quarters since the start of 2019, the quarterly growth rate has been less than 4.5%. So the fact is that we are finding that as the year goes on, for example, the current financial year, in the first quarter, we grew at around 13%. In the second quarter, we grew at around 6%. In the third quarter, for which the data just came in, we grew at around 4.4%. And in last quarter, we are expected that our growth might fall to just around 4%. And this is the same trend that happened the last financial year and even in pre-COVID period. So part of the thing, what Mr. Rajan is saying is actually true, that there is a sequential slowdown in quarterly growth rates. And it is also true that interest rates are rising across the world and the situation is not most conducive for high growth rate. So those are the two reasons. And it is important also to remember that before COVID happened, India's economy had already been slowing for 3 years. And just before COVID happened, in that last financial year, India economy grew at less than 4%. It grew at 3.9%. So there are many reasons to worry about the growth potential of India's economy, the kind of high growth that we expect from it, from that perspective.
Also, the main argument of the Hindu rate of growth, like you said, was that even though governments change and wars or famines happen, the rate at which India grows does not change. And so, if you're getting close to that level again, what do you think it says about the Indian economy and just the way we are handling it?
So there is something called a potential growth rate. Let me go back to the hard understanding that we have of any economy. There's something that is called the potential growth rate. For any economy, potential growth rate is the rate at which you can grow without fueling unnecessary inflation. So India's potential growth rate was something like 8.5%, say in the phase when we grew very fast between 2003-4 to 2007-8. And we grew at something like 9% or thereabout, slightly above the potential growth rate. But over the years, the potential growth rate has been slowing down. It slowed down to 7 odd percent by 2014. Then it had slowed down to around 6% before COVID. And this is a matter of record, which even the current chief economic advisor has accepted, that our potential growth rate had fallen to 6%. Now that tells you how much can you grow without fueling inflation. And now that potential growth rate is still thereabout, 6 or thereabout, which is to say that is the reason why you don't hear 8% growth as a factor from even the government. They also are not going to town saying we'll grow at 8%. Because, there is an understanding that the potential has come down over the years.
Yeah, before the pandemic, 8% used to be talked about a lot. But now we don't hear it at all, even from the finance minister.
And it goes back to the whole thing, whether we'll grow at 5% or 6% and in that range, or whether we'll grow at something like 8% or 9%. India typically talked about growing at 8%, 9%. In fact, I remember finance ministers used to say we have to grow at double digits. So means 10% over the next 2 decades to really recover and achieve our potential. But now we no longer are talking about that. We are only talking about, 6% or 5% or thereabout. So that basically shows that year on year, we are losing a lot of what we would have grown otherwise. So that's obviously there. I mean, the potential growth rate has come down, and that is a matter of worry. And the only way to improve that is by increasing the productive capacity of the economy. These things don't happen in a jiffy. So we took a decade and a half to fall from a potential growth rate of 8.5% to around 6%. And I think something similar time period would be needed to sort of recover that kind of growth rate. That is, if we invest in the economy in an intelligent manner.
And just to be clear, because the statement by Rajan has generated a lot of controversy, what we are experiencing right now is not the Hindu rate of growth, right?
So in a short sentence, are we at the Hindu rate of growth? No, we are not, because we are expected to grow at something around 7%. It might be 6.8 or thereabout for the current financial year. And the Hindu rate of growth is around 3.5. So we are obviously far away from it right now. But for the next financial year, many people think that India's growth rate may fall to 5.5 or even 5% level. And if that happens, then really it is listeners' choice to either label it as what Dr. Raghuram Rajan has said, being dangerously close to the Hindu rate of growth, or we can label it, as many other economists have started talking about it, calling the new Hindu rate of growth, that 5 or 6% is the new Hindu rate of growth. But these are just labels. What really matters is the actual growth rate, regardless of the labels that we use to identify them.
Now, when we talk about economic growth and prosperity, one important aspect of that is structural transformation, which is a shift from agriculture to other sectors.
See, any economy to start with has many people in agriculture, because that is the oldest economic activity which you can think of.
That's Harish Damodaran, Indian Express's rural affairs editor. And we spoke to him about what structural transformation means.
So as an economy grows, more and more people move away from the land into factories and into offices. So that is what is called structural transformation. An economy becomes more complex, and therefore the labor force moves from agriculture to manufacturing and to modern services. And that is a classical pattern which you see across all countries.
Moving away from agriculture usually means more income for the people concerned and more growth for the overall economy. Now, in a recent piece, Harish looked at the latest government data, specifically from the periodic labor force survey, to try and understand the extent to which structural transformation has happened in India. And turns out that we are actually seeing the opposite of what should be happening. In this segment, we talked to him about this data. Harish, so tell us what the data from the periodic labor force survey tells us about the extent to which people are still working in agriculture in India.
See, I mean, if you look at over a period of time, I think the early 90s, something like almost 65% of India's employed labor force, the workforce, was in agriculture. And that came down steadily. And in fact, it came down very significantly, especially during the 2000s. And by 2011-12, it had come down to about 49%. So from 65%, you are saying we are looking at from about 65% to about 49% in less than 20 years. So that is real structural transformation which was happening. And simultaneously, I think probably the percentage of the workforce which was in manufacturing, I think it peaked in 2011-12 at nearly 13%. But what we have seen since then is, this process has sort of slowed down. And what you find is the lowest it went was around, I think, 42.5% in 2018-19. But since then, what you have seen is actually the reverse. So in that sense, it's not just the structural transformation has slowed, but it has stalled, if not actually reversed. So actually, the latest data which we have is 2021-22, where the percentage of India's labor force in agriculture is higher than what it was in 2018-19. I think now it's about 45.5%, whereas in 2018-19, it was 42.5%.
So basically, compared to 2018, more people have joined agriculture in India.
Yes. So it's actually some kind of a reverse migration which is happening, which in a way it's not structural transformation. It's actually some kind of a structural retrogression, you can say. See, the problem is not that people are doing farming. The problem is that there are too many people who are doing farming. And again, the National Statistical Office's data shows that agriculture contributes about something like 19% of the gross value added in the economy. So basically, 19% of the incomes are from agriculture. But if 19% of incomes are in agriculture, and which in turn is employing now, 45.5%, so then there is a problem. Whereas, okay, suppose India is basically an agricultural economy, so therefore, suppose 45% of income was coming from agriculture, and it was, very high value agriculture. A lot of farmers were growing, grapes, oranges, horticultural crops. So then one could understand. Then, like, for example, you'll have, a country like Chile or somebody, which is largely an agrarian kind of a country, but they do very high value agriculture. So therefore, that is able to sort of absorb a lot of people in the farms. Whereas here we are talking of a sector which is generating only, 19% of India's income, but it is employing 45.5% of the workforce. So which is not a very pretty situation.
Okay, so in the Chile example, there are a lot of people in agriculture, but they are earning a lot more compared to, say, those in India, where there are a lot of people in agriculture, but they're not earning that much from it.
Yes. And what is happening that in India is that even if transfer of surplus labor from farms is happening, as I said, it is mostly to informal services sectors, which don't pay much. Whereas ideally what you should have is more people who are in factories. A factory job, an assembly line, there probably the incomes will be more. Suppose somebody is working in, a Maruti factory. That person may be drawing, about 30,000 rupees. Whereas here we are talking of people being employed as, security guards for maybe 10,000 rupees. So that is the problem in India. So we need very strong manufacturing. We need more jobs which will give you salary of, 25,000, 30,000, 35,000 rupees. Whereas what we are now seeing is maybe, salaries upwards of 1 lakh, or you are seeing salaries of, 15,000, very insecure kind of jobs. So I think that is the kind of transition which India should be making. And it looked like we were making this kind of a structural transformation maybe in the early 2000s, still about 2012, 2013. But after that, it first slowed and now it has reversed.
And Harish, this period we're talking about where this reverse migration has happened between 2018 and now, I mean, in the middle, the big disruption was COVID. Are we seeing that as a big contributing factor to this?
Possible. See, there's no doubt that the pandemic, etc., exacerbated this whole thing. But I think there is also some structural factor. Why manufacturing is not taking off in the country? Why is it that we are not having factories coming up? For example, even countries like, say, Bangladesh and Vietnam have been more successful in creating large-scale manufacturing employment, whereas India has not been able to do that kind of thing. And we have not been able to make that transition which, say, a China did and probably even a Vietnam or a Bangladesh have done. And without that, you cannot have this structural transformation. And ultimately, that is good for agriculture itself. I mean, if there are less number of people who are working in the farms, then agriculture itself can become more productive. If there are lesser number of people who are dependent on the land, then you have specialization. And only the people who are interested in farming and who are good in farming, they will do farming, and maybe, it can be slightly more mechanized. You can have more technology. You can do those kind of things, which is not happening in India, unfortunately, So agriculture continues to be suffering from low productivity. And at the same time, manufacturing is not absorbing the surplus labor force. And which is why you're seeing more of sort of informalization, which is not good in the long run for an economy like India. So that is what is very important thing. How do we generate jobs for kids who are passing out of class 10 and class 12? And that has to be probably in manufacturing and maybe skilled services, modern services. I won't say, modern services doesn't have to be IT. Everybody doesn't have to be a programmer or a coder, but there could be many other jobs, maybe in, say, things like X-ray technicians, medical services. Those are the kind of things where we need to create more jobs. And only then you will have the kind of growth in incomes and salaries, which can then spur consumption. I think that's very important to do.
Now, in the end, we talk about one of the ways in which the government is trying to boost the Indian economy. And this is through medical tourism. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi in a webinar said that India is aiming to become the most attractive medical tourism destination in the world, adding that this is a huge sector and a major medium of employment generation. In this segment, we talked to Indian Express's Anonna Dutt about it. Anonna, firstly, how do we define medical tourism?
So medical tourism is where people from other countries travel. For us, it is people from other countries traveling to India to get treatments for various ailments. But mostly it includes things like heart surgeries, complex heart surgeries, orthopedic surgeries, some cosmetic surgeries, things like that.
And right now, what are the countries from where people come to India for these purposes?
So, medical tourism in India has been a big thing, especially in a lot of these big private sector hospitals. We have been seeing medical tourists for a while, but now there is also a government push to increase the market because it's a revenue generator. But mostly we see people traveling from the neighboring countries, mainly from Bangladesh. Then there are other Southeast Asian countries that they come from, Middle Eastern countries, and some African countries. So these are the people who mainly come to India for treatment.
Right, and now PM Modi said that we are aiming to make India the biggest medical tourism destination. And you spoke to some experts about this. What did they tell you about how India can actually make that possible?
So the idea came about because it was already happening and we've been seeing a growth in the sector. But for the government to push for it, we need a lot of, not infrastructure per se, but healthcare professionals. There has traditionally been a shortage of doctors, nurses, and other technicians in our healthcare system, especially the government healthcare systems. And the government is now trying to address that. So since 2014 to now, the government has set up several new medical colleges attached to existing district hospitals. And the budget announcement that came out this year for 157 nursing colleges, these nursing colleges will be associated with the same 157 medical colleges that have come up since 2014. So basically what will happen with these nursing colleges, it will augment the workforce in hospitals. If you see any medical college hospital, a major percentage of the workforce is the resident doctors, who are basically PG students who work in the hospitals as a part of their training. And the same thing goes for nurses. So instead of hiring nurses, you would have nursing students there who would be working in the hospitals. So it'll improve the facilities in the hospital, along with creating these manpower, which will not only, and that's what PM Modi said in his post-webinar address, that this manpower that we create will not only be for Indians, but also will help other countries by, promoting this medical value tourism to have other people come in and get treatment here.
Okay, so one thing is that we need more resources. We need more doctors, we need more nurses. What are the other things that are required?
So I spoke to experts, and of course, they appreciated the move. There was a push for doctors, more medical colleges were set up. There hasn't been this kind of push for nursing before. So most people were very happy because there has been a dwindling number of nurses in, say, our PHCs and CHCs, which is also right now being promoted by the government because of this Ayushman Bharat mission, under which at the health and wellness centers, which is the primary health centers, you can get screening for various diseases like diabetes, heart diseases, and cancers, the most common ones. So we need these nurses to stay there as well. And one of the things that was suggested that, okay, yes, we need to train more nurses, but also we have to ensure that our nurses do not move to other countries. And that has been happening for a while. We have been training nurses who would first, get their education, then they would start working with smaller hospitals, move on to bigger hospitals, and then finally they would go to other countries like even Canada or in the Middle East. There are several countries that our nurses go to because the work conditions or the pay over there is much better.
So not only do we need to train resources, but we also have to retain them, ensure that they don't leave the country.
Yes, stay in the country, work in our PHCs and our hospitals. And for that, the simple solution is to provide them better salaries and better working conditions. That becomes difficult because, yes, for government postings, the nurses would come forward because the government jobs ultimately actually pay more than private sector nursing jobs in the country. So if there are posts vacant in our government sector, and I'm talking about mostly not the temporary posts, the permanent posts, people would come for that. But in private sector hospitals, it becomes extremely difficult to pay good salaries because private hospitals aren't making, or so they say, that they are not making too much money. Especially the small mom and pop nursing homes and smaller nursing homes run by doctors themselves, family members running hospitals. Those hospitals do not make a lot of money. And that is because most of the patients come to these hospitals with, say, CGHS coverage or Ayushman Bharat coverage or Delhi Arogya Kosh in Delhi. So the various government schemes, and those do not pay very well.
And could you talk about what is the difference between what a nurse earns in a private hospital versus a government hospital?
Oh, there's a huge difference. So, after completing training and all that, what I was told was nurses in a government hospital could earn about like 70,000 a month plus accommodation. But private hospitals, it would be like 20,000, 30,000. Of course, there is some increase depending on your number of services, but that's not much. So hospitals need to be incentivized to ensure that they pay their manpower better, to ensure that the manpower that we train do not go to other countries.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.